Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Book Shook, the open-air meeting place where Jewish stories, voices, and creative journeys come to life. I'm Yehudit Singer Freud, and in each episode, I sit down with authors to explore the books they've written. We uncover the questions and insights that shape their narratives, offering listeners a space to learn and to be inspired. If you're curious about Israel, contemporary Jewish life, Tanakh scholarship, what it takes to bring your book to life, this podcast is for you. Whether you're here for inspiration, practical publishing wisdom, or for a great conversation, I'd like to welcome you to the Book Shook. So today we're talking with Yael Leibowitz, who is the author of Ezra and Nehemia, Retrograde Revolution. The book was just published by the Matan Institute, the Kitzbuni program, and it's published together with Magid Books, which is part of Koren Publishers. So Yael lives here in Israel, and she's a Kitzbuni fellow, which she will tell you about. And she currently teaches at a number of seminaries here in Israel, and she also lectures throughout North America and in Europe. So Yael, welcome to the Book Shook. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I am curious, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where are you from? Where did you study?
Yeah, I'm originally from New York. I did my undergraduate at Stern College in history, and then my master's degree I did actually while I was teaching at the upper school of Ramaz. I was teaching Tanakh, and so I continued and did my master's there in Jewish studies. And then I taught after that at Stern College for 7 years, and then we made Aliyah in 2014, and now we're here.
Nice.
At Matan.
That's wonderful. Well, so you've been here for a while then.
Been here for a while, yeah.
Do you feel acclimated into Israeli culture?
Yeah, it's bizarre depending on the day. It's like some days you feel more Israeli than American, some days you feel more American than Israeli. I think that's part of the immigrant experience, is that you're never 100% either one anymore.
Absolutely. I totally relate to that.
It's a challenge, but it's also part of the thrill. So I have no complaints. Thank God.
Yes. So can you tell us a little bit more about your background and your interest in Tanakh? What inspired you to start studying Tanakh?
So I'll be honest, actually, when I was in post-high school and college, actually, I spent most of my time studying Talmud. That was actually really what interested me. And then when I decided that I wanted to try out education and see if the world of chinuch was the place for me. So I started teaching at Ramaz High School, Tanakh courses. And it was actually interesting. Once I started teaching it is actually when I really became more enthralled with it than ever. And that's when I continued my master's. And I was really lucky enough to take a bunch of visiting professors who would come over to Columbia and JTS in the summers and also during the year semesters. And, learning Tanakh through that academic lens totally transformed my experience of learning and really got me on that bandwagon of just exploring everything I can and trying to sort of read everything that comes out.
Is there a particular book in Tanakh that's your favorite?
A Sefer in Tanakh. I have to say Ezra and Nehemia, right? If we're trying to make sales. No, it's funny. I don't know that I would have realized Ezra and Nehemia was my favorite. Sometimes in life, people say things to you that you don't realize about yourself, and then you reflect on it, and you're like, I guess so. So I used to teach you in Tanakh in a local shul here, small Israeli shul by me, and they were having learning on Shavuot, and the guy, a man was giving a separate shiur, separate from mine, and he said, the time period that Yael loves the most, Shiva. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess that's it. And then it was just one of those perfect, serendipitous events, or hashgacha pratit, whatever you want to call it, that Koren then asked me if I would consider writing for the series, and I just, I had to do Ezra and Nehemia because he told me it's my favorite. So
it's amazing.
It really is, meaning it really, I think through teaching it, through learning it, and then of course by, spending that much time exploring the Sefer, it's impossible not to fall in love with it.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's not really so commonly studied in day schools or yeshivot. So I'd like to hear more about.
So I think you're right. I think for a very long time, Ezra and Nehemia is almost one of the Sfarim that most, as far as in my experience at least, day schools and even high school, in the States skip. I think for here in Israel, they have to know portions of it for the Bagrut. But I think on some level, actually, I don't know if it's ironic, but the very reason that it was less popular over the millennia is actually why I think it's so important to study it today. It talks about the return. It talks about what it means to be a Jew coming from exile and rebuilding, and what it means to reconstitute the state, and what it means to reconstitute your religious identity in that place. And so I think for a really long time, the content itself and the themes just, unfortunately, for so many years in exile, didn't resonate. If you think about Megillat Esther, it's the most popular, one of the most popular. It's not just because it's associated with Purim, it's because it speaks to the diaspora experience. It speaks to the vulnerability of being outside the land. What happens when an enemy wakes up one morning and decides he wants to kill you, and the leadership in that country goes along with it. Though, and then of course, in the end of the day, when we're victorious, but those stories, I think, resonated much more with Jews throughout the diaspora for many, many years. And there's actually more midrashim written about Sarim that were studied over the course of Jewish history. I think the theme of coming back and rebuilding, and what does it take, both technically and conceptually, wasn't relevant for thousands of years, but now it's more relevant than ever. That's what's so amazing about it. But sort of the flip side of why it wasn't popular is exactly why nowadays it should be.
It's interesting.
The most studied, in my opinion, or one of the most.
So let's just take a step back for a minute, because I am not so familiar with the context, with the historical context, and I would like to give our audience, an understanding of where we are in Jewish history.
We are essentially, the first temple was destroyed in 586 BCE. Israel had been in the land for a few hundred years prior. They got in around 1200 BCE, and the first temple in Jerusalem stood until about 586. By that point, there was really only 2 tribes essentially left. The other 10 had been exiled already by the Neo-Assyrians in the 8th century. The period that we're talking about is essentially with the rise of the Persian Empire after they defeated or conquered the Babylonians. The Persians basically said to all the ethnic minorities that had been exiled, here's your chance. Go back to your native land, build temples to your native gods, worship. And as long as you are loyal to the Persian authorities and you pay your taxes and you don't defy their rulings, basically you have the freedom of religion and the freedom to practice. And so it was an amazing turning point, really internationally, I think, in terms of imperialism and how empires saw themselves. But it was an amazing moment, obviously, in Jewish history. And so what we have at the beginning of the Sefer is the first wave of returnees, the brave Jews that left the comforts of their exilic experience, which at that point had really become a very comfortable experience. We don't have a tremendous amount of information about what happened in between the 2 temples, but the documents that we've unearthed from the day-to-day lives of Jews there, they really were thriving within a relatively short period of time after getting there. They stuck together, we know. There was the area called Al Yehudu, where all the Jews sort of were gravitating towards each other. But they were thriving in business. They owned lands. They were, they really had a wonderful experience. But then Cyrus got up and said, whoever wants to return can return. And the people that, that sort of understood that moment in history as a moment in which prophecies had the potential really to manifest were the ones that got up and they returned with the early leaders, which were Shatzar and Zerubbabel, and they brought the kelim from the first Beit HaMikdash back to the second, and they built the foundations. It wasn't a simple period. There were a lot of challenges. But essentially they rebuilt the temple. And then we have in the second half, the second wave of Jews that came in the period of Ezra and Nehemia, which was a little later on, but the work really talks about it as sort of one cohesive movement where all of the goals that were set by the early founders were eventually realized. And it's an incredible thing.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that there were challenges back then. So can you give us some examples? What were some of the challenges?
So listen, I'll talk about these sort of technical challenges, and then, as I mentioned before, some of the conceptual ones. The technical challenges, the community really didn't have a lot of money. Financially, they weren't well off. That was a big problem. They struggled with their neighbors, the people who had been living in the land all that time while the Jews had gone out to exile, weren't necessarily thrilled to see the Jews back. As I'm talking, I imagine the listeners are listening and hearing for the modern resonances, right? So people who had been living in the land were not thrilled to sort of make way for this Jewish project. And so there was a lot of pushback. There was the question of who is a Jew, which is a really big question. I spend an entire chapter dealing with that. In that early period of Israelite history, you're considered a Jew if you live in the land, you follow the rules, you keep the laws of the state, which were the laws of the Torah essentially, or ideally, then you're considered a Jew. Once you have the reality of Jews in Israel and the reality of Jews in the diaspora, so if we say geography is what demarcates your identity, then essentially the leaders would have been writing off the entire diaspora Jewry. And so the question of who is a Jew had to be asked and redefined. And it's, as we know from experience, change in Judaism is never a simple thing. It has to be done. It has to be done carefully. It has to be done, sometimes with nuance and sometimes broad strokes in what we might call a triage situation, and then the nuance comes later. That was the case at Ezra and Nehemia, so that was a major question. And then just the bigger questions. The prophets gave these unbelievable prophecies about, they said the first temple is going to be destroyed and you're going to go out to exile and you're going to bide your time and you're going to learn the hard-earned lessons. But then when you come back, don't worry, it's going to be amazing. And there were these grand, sort of end of days prophecies about the 12 tribes being united. And, Yecheskel speaks of this gorgeous temple that's going to outshine anything the first temple could. And then they got back, and the reality was really far from those utopian visions of those prophets. And so I would say, sort of conceptually, the biggest challenge, and I think that is, exists today as well, is what do we do when the reality we're living in doesn't match up to those promises of perfection? And there were a lot of voices, by the way, in the days of Ezra and Nehemia who just sort of assumed, well, if it's not perfect, then this can't be the end, right? And there were a lot of Jews that stayed, not just because they didn't have the, what it took to come to the land, but because really they believed that the exile didn't end if things were not yet perfect. And part of what I think is so central to Ezra and Nehemia is that their leaders are saying, perfection doesn't fall from the sky, right? Perfection is what we create with this moment in history. When we can look at our history and we could say, this is a moment we don't want to miss, right? This king just gave us permission to come back. And we can't squander that opportunity. It doesn't mean it's perfect, but it means that it's on us to go back and make it as good as we can possibly make it. And the constant struggles of the leaders, of the people throughout the period is depicted in a way that is so real and so raw. And again, if we put them in different clothing, it's so us.
So do you feel that there are similarities to the establishment of the state of Israel and the Aliyah is coming and the
parallels don't stop, right? Like you just mentioned, the waves of Aliyah coming in different waves and the different goals of each group. The goals of the first wave were not identical to the goals of the second wave. And the leaders play a very, very careful game of diplomacy. Nehemia is high up in the Persian court, and he asks these, he sort of very, very carefully asks the king if he can go back and help his brethren because his loyalties are to them, even though he makes it very clear his loyalties are still to the Persians and he'll come back. And so, playing the game of diplomacy, playing the game of international politics is in many ways new in Ezra and Nehemia in the sense that we're, I would say sort of tethering all of those different interests all at the same time. The issue of intermarriage was a big, big issue. There was a sense among the leaders and much of the populace that if we're going to rebuild here, we're not just coming back to the land, right? We're coming back because we need to know who we are. We need to know what we fought so hard to get back to, and we need to know what we're fighting so hard to rebuild. And if we're just like everybody else, then what are we doing here, right? And so a lot of it, intermarriage is really the medium through which I think the state talks about how we understand ourselves, how we understand our unique mission in the world, how we understand what this whole experiment is all about. Right? So all of these questions, I think, are questions that if you think about it, we're asking today. How do we balance international diplomacy? How do we redefine who we are as a people? Because getting to the land is never the goal, right? Getting to the land is the means to the entirety of the project, which is being that unique people among the nations and being that moral compass and that moral guide. Balancing our relationship with the diaspora, making sure that there's an understanding, that on the one hand, Israel is center and Israel is that sort of epicenter that we're always, Jews everywhere should always be moving towards, or at least hoping to be moving towards, that they should be tethered to it. And at the same time, knowing that peoplehood is no less important, that we can't imagine that Israel is the center and that everything else just ceases to exist, right? That people is a really, really central core tenet of the state as well. And the leaders went out of their way to make sure that there was a shared language and a shared way of speaking about what it is to be a Jew so that no one was disenfranchised, which is, I think, more than ever something we need to be aware of.
As you're talking, I'm hearing that there are just so many different layers and angles to this book. And I'm curious if you could give us an idea, open the window to your process in terms of how you went about researching, all the analysis and how did you go about writing this book and doing the research necessary to publish like this?
So it's a great question. I originally taught a course in Ezra and Nehemia. So that was sort of the foundation for the ideas and the themes that I thought were central to the work were sort of already there because I had worked them through to teach. But, writing is a totally different animal. I would say, this may sound very simplistic and not super sophisticated, but I follow footnotes, right? So I find, I'll start I'm doing it now. There's a new course I'm developing on prophecy. So I start with, I go on Amazon or I go on any website and find the books that look the most interesting. I, Google Scholar, everything I can get my hands on. But I know that that's going to be the first step. And then as I read the articles and then the footnotes always lead you on totally different paths. And so that's really, again, it may not be very methodical, but that's really my process is I start with.
It sounds like it is methodical.
It's a lot of fun because if you don't go in ahead of time knowing where you want to go, then it really leaves you open to, following any footnote, buying a new book, ordering, downloading a new article. And it sort of, weaves you in this path. And then you turn around and look back and you're like, never anticipated that. But, it's a lot of fun because it's almost like an adventure as you're learning.
Yeah, it sounds like it is.
Like if you go shopping, it's like if you go shopping because you need a specific blouse for a specific skirt, or if you just like walk into the store and whatever suits your fancy, you're going to, touch and try on. I would say my process is more the latter, which makes it in my mind so much more exciting.
Did you published this book under the Kitvuni program, and that's a program through Matan. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about that program and like what kind of support or, mentorship did you have? Did you have any support throughout this process?
So I'll say the Kitvuni program is incredible. I don't know if your listeners know what Matan is altogether, but just, in a sentence, Matan really, Rabbanit Malka Bina, close to 40 years ago, realized that Jewish women need to be learning at a higher level. And she opened up Matan, which really, I would say, changed the face of women's learning within the world of Orthodoxy. And then, fast forward 30 something years, her vision worked and women everywhere were learning. And so the next question was, okay, so now what's the next frontier? What's the next, hurdle we have to push through? And they came up with the Kitvuni Fellowship, which is this amazing program where essentially what they're saying is to women who have been learning and studying and teaching all these years, if you have a book inside of you, we're here to help birth it, so to speak, right? For lack of a better metaphor. And that's what they do. And they give you the time and they get a mentor. Professor Ari Mermelstein from Yeshiva University was my mentor. He was my first choice and I was really, really excited that he agreed to do it. And, the mentor is more just of a point person to turn to and say, here's what I'm thinking, or here's the chapter I just wrote, check it over. What are you thinking? But it gives you that sense of, okay, there's quality control, which is really big, I think, for someone writing their first book. And, and there's collegiality, there's other women writing. So you have people to bounce ideas off of, people to complain that you don't know how to balance everything in your life at that moment, things like that, which is also not something to...
For sure. Now, I see that in the book, you address, like I said, so many different layers. You have the political issues going on at the time. You have the cultural issues. You have the historical, the religious, theological issues. So when you were in the process of writing the book, how did you decide which topics to cover?
I think, again, going back to that process of mine, the unsophisticated process, I think at the end of the day, what happens is that on some level you start it could be personality, right? Those are the themes I was drawn to. And I necessarily imagine that this is a roadmap for modern times. So maybe I was looking for those themes. But I do think there are certain themes in every Sefer in Tanakh that are more overt than others and more sort of central than others. When I teach Tanakh to my students, I always, it's not about like, let me read this book so I know what happened. It's let me read this book so I understand what the author of this specific Sefer is trying to communicate to me through the medium of history or storytelling. Right? That's what we're doing when we study Tanakh. We're not asking what happened to David or what happened in the days of Shoftim. We're saying, okay, what theme or what idea is this author trying to tell me? And how is he using and sort of, again, manipulating without any pejorative connotations, but how is he utilizing his storytelling, his methodology in order to communicate that? So I think once you start thinking that way in Tanakh, the themes really become self-evident, but you have to sort of train your mind to ask that question as the first step, not as as one of the end steps.
So interesting. So what do you feel that the authors Ezra and Nehemiah were trying to communicate to us?
So you touched on something. We're not sure the authors were Ezra and Nehemiah. It's possible there was an
Oh,
author there, but it's interesting you say that. There are certain portions that were for sure Ezra and Nehemiah because they're first-person autobiographical portions, which is unique in Tanakh altogether. So it's not clear if a final editor sort of pieced all the pieces, the narrations and the autobiographical portions together. That's part of the fun of trying to understand how all these different voices were incorporated into one work, which I think is part of another theme, right? That Judaism holds many different discordant voices all at the same time, and that doesn't detract from the whole, right? The whole is greater than the sum of all of those different parts. What do I think their main theme is? Question again.
so what would you say the authors of these books are trying to communicate to us?
Okay, so it's hard to summarize, I guess, in one word. I think what they're telling us as Jews, I would say sort of for our moments, right, what we should be internalizing from their understanding of history is what it means to be a resilient Jew. Being a Jew in history doesn't mean things are going to be easy. Being a Jew in history is being able to sort of hold on to your past, your imperfect past, your imperfect present, learn from that past and understand that if you can do that, if you are empowered and you believe enough in the ability to evolve as a people, to shift the trajectory of where we're going, then the future that awaits us is always brighter, right? We sometimes glorify the past and we sometimes imagine this like perfect moment in the future that we're getting towards. And that in many ways is disempowering for people because if nothing you're living through can match either of those fantasies, then there's something really disappointing about the reality. And I think Ezra and Nehemiah are all about, I hate to borrow a modern term, but they were mindfulness, right? They were very much about living in this moment, making this moment as extraordinary as possible. Always with an eye towards where are we headed as people, right? We're not passive recipients of what history has to offer us. We are actors in history. How do we do that? How do we maximize every moment that we are living in to make sure that our fate as a people is clearly defined and that we are manifesting that fate, not allowing sort of historical contingencies to define our experiences.
So they were both leaders of the Jewish nation in the ancient world. And I'm curious if you could how would you describe their models of leadership? What words come to mind to describe them?
Okay, so Ezra was a man of the people. Ezra was all about, everything kingship did wrong by, prioritizing pomp and circumstance and power and seizing power and maintaining power. Ezra was the opposite. Ezra really, and it's interesting because Chazal revere Ezra. There are certain midrashim on Ezra that would, that if you didn't see it actually printed on the page of a book of Midrash, you wouldn't believe it. They say things like, had Ezra lived prior to Moshe or at the same time as Moshe, the Torah would have been given by him as opposed to Moshe, which is a pretty, bold, staggering statement for Chazal to make. But I think in many ways, Chazal see Ezra as a proto-rabbi in the sense that it wasn't just about bringing people back to the text and understanding that Jewish literacy is key to understanding who we are as a people and defining what it means to be a Jew. But I think he understood that it's not about the leader, it's about the movement, and it's about the movement existing beyond the leader. There was something humble about Ezra, humble and powerful all at the same time, which is a really rare mix when we're talking about leaders. But his humility came, I think, from his belief in his project and his belief in his mission, as opposed to his belief in himself. So he was a man of the people. He empowered them. He wanted it to be a grassroots operation, and he enabled the people really to see. There's a great little episode in there where, the people start crying when they start learning the Torah. They're crying because they felt that they had fallen so far from the ideals that the Torah set. And, if we look back at episodes in the past with Nevi'im scolding the people and criticizing them and, Ezra and Nehemiah both are like, no, guys, there's nothing to be sad about, right? This is what having the Torah is. It's about seeing where we were wrong and improving. And you have the text in front of you. This is a day to celebrate. Go give out candies to your kids. Go celebrate. That sets the tone for what return is really all about. That you have that text that you can go back to. And again, if you compare that model of leadership where you're telling the people that they have the tools they need, they just need to figure out how to use them, that's completely different than anything we saw in the past. So Ezra is a man of the people. Nehemiah was bold, and Nehemiah was a decision maker. I think I personally look to Nehemiah. I'm one of those people that, if someone says something, my kids are arguing about, politics, and one says something, and I'm like, yeah, I hear you. I think you're right. And then my other son says something and I'm like, maybe you're right. And they always yell at me that like, I don't take a stand. Right. And I think there's something great in theory in life about being able to hear all different sides, but to be a leader, sometimes you need to take a stand, even if it's not popular and even if it's a difficult position to put yourself in. And even if you're nervous that history may not remember you fondly. I made some really, really, I would say, made very big decisions and employed even, you could say, draconian measures to make sure those decisions were followed through. The people, his contemporaries, did not like him very much at all, I would say, or not at all, but his many, many contemporaries were not fond of those decisions because they were difficult and they were harsh. But he saved, really, in many ways, it was an existential crisis and he averted it through those difficult decisions. So Ezra is the humble man of the people. Nehemia is the savvy politician who makes difficult decisions, even if they're unpopular. And the two of them, the symbiosis of the two of them was really saved the people. It enabled us to move forward to the next phase in history.
Wow. Wow. That's just so beautiful and so intriguing. It's so intriguing. I feel like
I encourage everyone to read the Sefer. And again, my book is meant just to make the Sefer accessible. There's a lot of Aramaic portions and there's a lot of portions where the chronology seems confusing. And so my goal with the Sefer really was just to make the goal, I would say, with my book was to make the Sefer accessible to people, because I think it is the most valuable Sefer that we could be reading right now. And so if people, have that sort of breakdown and they can understand how to navigate it, that was my goal.
it's beautiful. So while we're on the topic of leadership, I'm going to leap ahead and I'm going to be bold and say I view you as a leader. I think that you're really breaking the mold as, a woman who is teaching and educating, and that you've had this tremendous opportunity to publish this book. And I'm wondering, just, in terms of, we talk about work-life balance. You're a teacher, you're a scholar, you made Aliyah, you're a mom. How do you balance this all? How did you find time to write this book?
All right, so I'll tweak what you said just a tiny bit. I think the leaders were the women who paved the path. I was just put on this path that has already been paved for me. And I had the luxury of taking advantage of it. The leaders, I really believe, and I'm not just saying this is not like false humility, I really believe the leaders were the ones who enabled the women of my generation to be able to do things like this. But I think once that path has been paved, it really is important for women to try to seize those opportunities. How do I balance it all? You're making a big assumption that I balance anything, Yehudit. I think, listen, at the end of the day, it comes down to priorities, right? To knowing what we find valuable, knowing what we love, knowing what brings us both joy and satisfaction, and trying to make time for that and sort of prune everything else in life that doesn't do that for you, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think the older I get, the more I prune.
It's wonderful. And just to end off, I'm curious to know, what is one thing that you'd like to do this year that you haven't accomplished so far?
I haven't accomplished so far. I have a second book in the works that I would love to publish. Yeah, very, very different style, much less academic, actually towards exactly your point, to sort of empower women. I think there's a lot of stories about women in Tanakh that are understudied. That I would say for this year, that's my goal, is to get that book out there into the world and really allow young girls, mothers, women everywhere to feel empowered by the women in Tanakh, because Tanakh was actually very, misunderstood as a misogynistic work, as a chauvinistic work. The Tanakh is anything but. Tanakh was light years ahead in terms of how it saw women, in terms of how it valued women. I think what we're doing today is actually much more in line with how Tanakh saw women and their role within the community. So yeah, that would be my dream for this year. If I can get that work out into the world and help empower women everywhere through the stories of our ancestresses, that would be the dream.
Well, Yael, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. And I wish you so much luck and success with everything that you're doing. And I hope that all of our listeners and our viewers get a copy of Ezra and Nehemia, and also consider donating a copy to one of their local, to a Jewish library, to a Beit Midrash, a shul, a yeshiva. As you could see, I mean, there's just so much to these books, and I really believe that you're inspiring a lot of people to to get into Tanakh learning. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for
And
having
to all of our viewers out there, please share this interview if you have enjoyed it, and subscribe to our channel and help us grow this Bookshop community. Thank you very much.
me. Thanks so much.